It was just another quiet afternoon in the city. The streets were alive with their usual rhythm. Cars honked, bicycles whizzed by, and pedestrians hurried along, their footsteps blending into the hum of an urban symphony. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow across the buildings. Life was moving fast, as it always did. No one paid much attention to the small cafe nestled on the corner of Maple Street, its glass windows slightly smudged from the day's traffic. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere was calm, almost sleepy. A soft hum of conversation floated through the air, blending with the occasional clink of coffee mugs on wooden tables. The barista behind the counter worked quietly, steam rising in gentle puffs as she prepared another latte. People sat in their favorite spots, some reading newspapers, others glued to their phones or tapping away on laptops. Near the large window at the front, a man sat alone. He was an unassuming figure, the kind of person you'd glance at and forget just as quickly. His wheelchair was parked neatly beside him, its sleek frame almost disappearing into the background. He wore a simple blue jacket and faded jeans, nothing flashy, nothing that drew attention. His hands, resting lightly on the table, were steady and strong, though few would notice. A cup of coffee sat in front of him, the steam curling lazily into the air. To anyone walking past, he was just another customer. Just another guy sipping his drink and watching the world go by. But the truth was, he saw everything. Every movement, every glance, every sound. The man noticed it all. His eyes were sharp, even if his gaze was calm. People passed by the cafe window without a second thought, wrapped up in their own lives. A woman hurried to catch a bus, balancing her purse and groceries. A teenager skateboarded past, his laughter echoing through the street. A businessman in a crisp suit checked his watch as he made a phone call, barking orders to someone on the other end. To the world outside, the man in the cafe was invisible. But they didn't know. No one knew who he really was. They didn't know about the countless hours he had spent training, pushing his body and mind to their very limits. They didn't see the sweat, the pain, or the moments of doubt he'd faced over the years. They couldn't picture the roaring crowds, the shining podiums, or the weight of gold medals resting against his chest. At home, in a room he rarely talked about, those medals hung proudly on the wall. Each one represented a story, a challenge overcome, a battle won, a moment of triumph. But today, there were no cameras, no roaring fans. Today, he was just a man in a wheelchair, drinking coffee in a quiet cafe. And that was exactly how he wanted it. He liked the quiet. He liked the normalcy. After years of competition and constant movement, days like this were a rare gift. He could sit and simply be. No pressure, no expectations. The man leaned back slightly in his chair, taking a slow sip of his coffee as he watched the sunlight flicker through the window. Outside, life moved on, unaware of the quiet strength sitting just inside. Then the door opened. It wasn't anything unusual at first. The small bell above the cafe door jingled softly, just like it always did. A small breeze swept through the room, fluttering napkins on nearby tables. The man glanced up briefly, just a habit, then returned to his coffee. But something felt different. The energy in the cafe shifted. It was subtle at first, like a faint hum in the air that didn't belong. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed as a group of people entered. They weren't quiet. The first guy through the door let it slam behind him, making heads turn. 3 more followed, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in worn leather jackets. The cafe seemed to shrink as they walked in, their presence commanding attention. The man in the wheelchair didn't react. He'd seen people like this before, loud, overconfident, and always searching for someone to bother. He kept his gaze on his coffee, his expression calm and unreadable. The group moved toward the counter, laughing loudly as they spoke. Their voices carried across the room, breaking the peaceful silence like a rock through glass. A few customers glanced their way, uneasy but silent. The barista behind the counter greeted them politely, but her voice held a hint of nervousness. 3 coffees, one of them said gruffly. Make 'em quick. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos crawling up his arms, turned and looked around the cafe. His gaze was sharp and predatory, like someone searching for an easy target. He smirked, nudging one of his friends. Quiet little place, huh? Looks like we livened it up. They laughed, the sound grating and out of place. A man near the door grabbed his laptop and slipped out quietly, clearly eager to avoid any trouble. The man in the wheelchair still didn't look up. He'd dealt with noise before. He'd dealt with far worse. Years of training had taught him patience, how to keep calm when the world around him was anything but. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, his movements deliberate and relaxed. But then, the leader's gaze fell on him. It started with a glance, a quick flicker of the eyes, barely noticeable. Then it lingered. The smirk on the biker's face widened, and his footsteps carried him closer to the window table. Well, look at this, the biker said loudly, his voice dripping with mock amusement. Didn't see you sitting there, buddy. The cafe grew quieter. Heads turned, though most people tried to pretend they weren't watching. The man in the wheelchair finally looked up, his eyes meeting the biker's. His expression was still calm, almost indifferent, as if he were looking at just another stranger on the street. No problem, the man replied evenly. His voice was steady, measured. I'm not in your way. The biker tilted his head, pretending to think about it. No, you're not. Not yet, anyway. His friends chuckled from a few feet away, enjoying the show. What's a guy like you doing here all alone? Can't be much fun. The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. Something in his calm, unshaken demeanor seemed to bother the biker. He leaned closer, resting his hands on the edge of the table. The cafe felt tense, like a held breath waiting to be released. You don't talk much, huh? The man shrugged. Just drinking my coffee. The biker narrowed his eyes, his smirk fading slightly. He wasn't used to people ignoring him. You're a quiet one, I'll give you that, he said, his voice lower now, more menacing. But you're taking up a pretty good spot here by the window. Maybe it's time to move. The man didn't move. He simply stared back, his gaze steady, unwavering. I'm comfortable where I am, he said. For a moment, there was silence. The biker's jaw tightened, his ego clearly stung. He straightened up, laughing as if to cover his irritation. Suit yourself, Wheels, he said, turning back to his friends. No harm in letting the guy have his coffee. He's not bothering anyone, right? They laughed again, though it felt forced. The man in the wheelchair watched them carefully as they returned to the counter. He knew this wasn't over. People like that rarely stopped after just one poke. Outside, the afternoon sun continued to shine, the streets still bustling. To anyone walking by, the cafe looked the same as it always did, a quiet little corner in a busy city. But inside, something had shifted. The man took another sip of his coffee, his calm expression unchanged. His mind, however, was sharp and ready. He'd faced challenges far greater than this group of loud bikers. What they didn't know, what no one in the cafe knew, was that they were dealing with someone who didn't break easily. They didn't know what he was capable of. Not yet. And soon, they'd regret finding out. The cafe fell back into a tense sort of quiet. People returned to their drinks, their books, and their conversations, but the energy wasn't the same. The laughter and banter from the group at the counter lingered, filling the space like a storm cloud waiting to break. The man in the wheelchair kept his eyes on his coffee cup, turning it gently in his hands as if nothing had happened. On the surface, he looked relaxed, almost indifferent. But inside, he was far from unaware. Years of experience had sharpened his instincts, turning them into something like a sixth sense. He could feel the weight of the biker's stares, even with his back turned. He knew the leader wasn't done. Bullies like him never stopped at one push. They enjoyed the thrill of being noticed, of feeling like they were in control. And when someone didn't react the way they wanted, when someone didn't give them the fear or submission they craved, they pushed harder. Outside the window, the city continued its dance. The sun dipped lower in the sky, stretching shadows across the street. People rushed by, caught up in their own lives, completely unaware of the small drama unfolding inside the cafe. The bikers were still at the counter, laughing loudly at some joke no one else could hear. Occasionally, one of them would glance over at the man in the wheelchair, their smirks growing wider. He ignored them. For now. A group of teenage girls sitting near the door glanced nervously at the bikers, whispering to each other and giggling uncomfortably. An older man, seated with his newspaper near the back, adjusted his glasses and shook his head. It was clear that everyone felt the tension. But no one said anything. It was always like this. When people like the bikers barged in, they took up all the space in the room, not physically, but with their presence. They threw off the balance, filling the air with their loud voices, their heavy footsteps, and their need to be noticed. Most people chose to stay quiet, to avoid confrontation. The man in the wheelchair understood that. Most people weren't built for conflict. But he was different. The leader of the group finished his coffee and slammed the cup on the counter, making the barista flinch. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and turned toward the man by the window again. The smirk was back, and this time, it was even sharper. The man could hear him approaching before he even looked up. The boots, the heavy, deliberate thuds of someone who wanted to be heard, moved across the cafe floor like a drumbeat. He stopped just in front of the wheelchair, casting a shadow over the table. "Well, Wheels," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Still sittin' there all quiet, huh? You really don't talk much." The man finally looked up, meeting the biker's gaze head on. "I don't see much reason to talk," he replied evenly. The biker's eyebrows shot up. His friends still at the counter chuckled darkly, clearly enjoying the show. "You don't see much reason to talk," the biker repeated slowly, his tone mocking. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man shrugged. "It means you're not saying anything worth responding to." The cafe went completely silent. Even the barista paused mid-motion, her eyes wide. The biker's smirk faltered for just a second before he laughed loudly, throwing his head back. It was the kind of laugh that was meant to show everyone he was still in control. The kind of laugh that masked anger underneath. "You got a little mouth on you, huh?" he said, stepping closer to the table. "A little mouth, and a lot of attitude." The man didn't move. His hands remained steady on the coffee cup, his expression calm. "You seem like someone who's used to getting his way," the man said, his voice measured. "Is that right?" The biker's smile faded completely now. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. The cafe felt smaller than it had a moment before, the air thick with tension. "What did you just say?" the biker growled. The man didn't repeat himself. He didn't have to. The point had already landed. At the counter, the biker's friends shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. It was subtle, but the man noticed it. They were starting to sense something, though they couldn't quite put their fingers on it. The leader, though, wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. Bullies like him couldn't stand being challenged, especially not by someone they had already decided was weak. "You know, I think you're sitting there a little too comfortably," the biker said, leaning down so his face was level with the man's. His voice was low, threatening. "Maybe it's time you move along." The man didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, the calm in his movements only making the biker angrier. "Maybe you should move along," the man said quietly. The biker stared at him, unblinking. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The cafe was completely still, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Finally, the biker straightened up and laughed again, a short, humorless sound. "You've got some nerve, man. I'll give you that." The man didn't respond. He simply placed his coffee cup back on the table and waited. He didn't know what the biker was going to do next. Maybe he would walk away, deciding the interaction wasn't worth it. Or maybe he wouldn't. Either way, the man was ready. He had faced far worse. As the biker loomed over him, the man's mind drifted back for a brief moment to a memory long buried. Years ago, he had faced a challenge that most people couldn't imagine. It was a hot summer afternoon, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the track. He could still remember the heat, the way it pressed against his skin like a weight. His hands ached from gripping the wheels of his racing chair, sweat dripping from his brow. His lungs burned, and his muscles screamed for him to stop. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because he was racing for more than just himself. He remembered the roar of the crowd in the distance, growing louder with every push, every turn of the wheels. He remembered the finish line getting closer, inch by inch. He could still see the faces of his competitors, their determination matching his own. And he remembered crossing that line first. The gold medal had been heavy in his hands, but the pride in his chest was heavier. That day, he had proven to the world and to himself that limits were meant to be broken. It wasn't about winning. It was about showing what he was capable of. That's why he didn't flinch now. Because the man who sat in that wheelchair, the man the biker saw as weak, was someone forged by fire. Someone who had spent years turning his pain into power. The memory passed as quickly as it had come. The man looked up at the biker again, his calm gaze unwavering. The leader was still staring down at him, clearly unsure of what to do. He had expected this man to be afraid, to cower or back down. But he wasn't doing any of that. And that more than anything seemed to unnerve him. "Let's go," one of the biker's friends called from the counter, his voice uneasy. "We're wasting time here." The leader hesitated, his pride warring with his instincts. Finally, he stepped back, though his glare remained sharp. "Next time, Wheels," he muttered. "You won't be so lucky." The man didn't say anything. He just watched as the bikers turned and walked out of the cafe, their boots pounding against the wooden floor. When the door swung shut behind them, the tension in the room lifted like a weight being pulled off everyone's shoulders. Conversations started up again, though they were quieter than before. The barista let out a long breath and glanced at the man in the wheelchair. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The man smiled faintly. "I'm fine," he replied. "It's not the first time." She nodded, still looking a little shaken. "Well, you handled that better than anyone else would have." The man didn't respond. He just turned back to his coffee, picking it up as if nothing had happened. Because, to him, it was nothing. He had faced far greater challenges than a few loud bikers. And if they came back, well, they still didn't know who they were dealing with. The deep rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the calm of the afternoon, growing louder as they approached. Outside the cafe window, a group of bikers rolled to a stop, parking their bikes in a line like a wall of steel and chrome. Sunlight glinted off polished handlebars, and the sound of engines shutting down was replaced by loud, boisterous laughter. It was the kind of laughter that announced their arrival before they even stepped inside, the kind meant to intimidate, to claim space before they even entered it. People walking along the sidewalk glanced nervously at the group. A mother steered her child in the opposite direction, picking up her pace. A businessman waiting at the bus stop looked down at his shoes, pretending not to notice. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere had been warm and relaxed, the kind of place where strangers shared polite smiles and regulars chatted with the barista. But when the cafe door swung open, all of that changed. A gust of wind carried the noise in, with them the scrape of heavy boots against the floor, the faint scent of leather, gasoline, and cheap cologne. Conversations died mid-sentence. Cups clinked softly against saucers as hands paused, mid-motion. Heads turned, but not for long. Most people were quick to look away, pretending to be absorbed in their phones or coffee cups. Nobody wanted to draw attention to themselves. The man in the wheelchair, however, didn't move. Didn't even glance up. He kept his focus on the same coffee cup he'd been nursing for the last 20 minutes, his fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. If he noticed the shift in the room, he didn't let it show. The bikers stomped in, their presence loud and overbearing. They moved like they owned the place, spreading out and scanning the room as though sizing it up. There were 4 of them, each one bigger, louder, and rougher looking than the last. Leather jackets adorned with patches told the story of their group. Heavy boots marked each step like hammer strikes. And then there was their leader. He was tall, his presence casting a shadow even in the well-lit cafe. Tattooed arms bulged from the sleeves of his worn leather jacket. Dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but his smirk said everything. He was the type who thrived on control, on the feeling of being in charge, of being the loudest, strongest, most dominant man in the room. He glanced around, his eyes skimming over the patrons. Nervous glances darted away. The barista behind the counter stiffened, her hands faltering as she prepared a cappuccino. Nobody dared say anything. Nobody dared breathe too loudly. It was as if the entire cafe had shrunk in size. And then the leader saw him. The man in the wheelchair. Sitting quietly by the window, completely unbothered by the world around him. Something about it made the biker's smirk widen, curling cruelly at the edges. He jabbed a thumb toward the man as if signaling to his friends. The others followed his gaze, and their laughter picked up low, mocking chuckles. They were like hyenas spotting an easy target. Without hesitation, the leader walked toward him, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. The sound echoed through the silent room like the ticking of a bomb. The man in the wheelchair didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could feel them coming. Years of experience had given him a kind of heightened awareness and ability to sense trouble before it arrived. And trouble, as he knew, was now standing directly in front of him. The biker stopped by the table, looming over him. He tilted his head as if examining the man, his sunglasses reflecting the wheelchair parked neatly beside the table. "You're in my seat, Wheels," the biker sneered. His voice was loud, dripping with mockery. It was the kind of voice designed to draw everyone's attention, to put on a show. The man glanced up slowly, his expression calm. Unreadable. He met the biker's gaze, or at least the space behind the sunglasses, and then looked around the cafe. "There's plenty of seats around," he said evenly. His tone wasn't rude. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply a statement of fact. Wrong answer. The biker's smirk widened into something nastier. A dark chuckle rumbled in his throat. Behind him, his friends laughed too loud enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't real laughter. It was the kind that made your stomach turn, the kind you knew meant someone was being made into a joke. "I don't think you heard me, pal," the biker said, leaning closer. His tattooed hand reached out and wrapped around the man's coffee cup. The cafe held its breath. Without warning, the biker tilted the cup. The dark liquid spilled over the edge, cascading like a tiny waterfall and hitting the wooden floor with a soft splash. Drops splattered against the man's shoes and the wheels of his chair, leaving dark stains on the clean white tile beneath. For a moment, the only sound in the cafe was the drip, drip, drip of coffee hitting the floor. Someone gasped softly from the other side of the room. The man didn't flinch. He didn't lunge or yell. Instead, he stared at the biker, his eyes calm and focused. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to meet the biker's again. "You shouldn't have done that," he said softly. There was no anger in his tone. No rage or trembling frustration. It was too calm, so calm that it was unsettling. The biker blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected shouting, anger, or even tears. People like the man in the wheelchair weren't supposed to fight back. That's why he'd chosen him in the first place. But this guy didn't react the way he was supposed to. Behind him, one of the other bikers snorted. "What are you gonna do about it, huh?" he taunted. "Call someone to come help you." Another biker chimed in with a laugh. "I think he's waiting for his mommy." The group roared with laughter, their voices echoing off the walls. Patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some stared at their coffee cups, pretending not to see. Others sneaked glances, frozen by a mixture of curiosity and fear. The man still didn't move. To anyone watching, he must have seemed helpless. A man alone in a wheelchair, surrounded by bikers twice his size. Outnumbered. Outmatched. Or so they thought. "Nothing to say now," the leader pressed, leaning closer. His voice dropped to a low, threatening whisper. "You don't look so tough sitting there, do you?" The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at the floor where his spilled coffee pooled by the biker's boots. Then, without rushing, he wiped his hands on a napkin and set it down on the table. Finally, he spoke. "I've met your type before," he said quietly. The biker frowned. "My type?" The man nodded. "The ones who think being louder makes you stronger. The ones who pick on people because it makes you feel bigger." The biker's smile vanished. His jaw clenched, and the sunglasses slipped down his nose just enough to reveal cold, angry eyes. "You think you're funny, huh?" he growled. The man didn't answer. He simply held the biker's gaze, refusing to look away. It was a small thing, really. Just eye contact. Just a quiet stare. But there was something in it that unsettled the biker. Something that said this man wasn't afraid. And people like him didn't know what to do when someone wasn't afraid. One of the other bikers took a step closer. "Hey, boss, maybe he needs a little help out of that chair," he said, cracking his knuckles for emphasis. The man's hand curled slightly on the armrest of his chair. Not in fear. Not in anger. But in readiness. "If I were you," he said softly, "I'd think very carefully about what you do next." The leader froze. Something about the way he said it, so steady, so controlled, sent a ripple through him. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression. And in that brief silence, the man's calm voice cut through like a knife. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" The biker leader straightened up slightly, as if trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to someone looking at him like that, unmoved, unintimidated, and calm to the point of being unnerving. "What did you just say?" the leader sneered, his voice now a touch more forceful, a touch more unsure. The man in the wheelchair didn't blink. His gaze didn't waver. He just leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming softly on the armrest, each tap measured and deliberate. "I said you don't know who you're dealing with." The words hung heavy in the air, each syllable sinking into the growing silence. It wasn't just the bikers who noticed it. Everyone else in the cafe had their eyes on the scene now. Even the barista, who'd been pretending to clean the espresso machine, froze mid-wipe. The leader barked a laugh, but it sounded forced. "Oh, that's rich. You're telling me," he pointed an accusing finger, "that I don't know who I'm dealing with?" The man nodded once. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." The leader's lips curled into a scowl, and his friends stepped closer. Their boots stomped against the floor with heavy thuds, like a slow drum beat building towards something inevitable. One of them cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp and deliberate. You got a mouth on you for someone sitting down, one of the bikers muttered, his voice dripping with menace. He stepped forward, looming at the man's side. Maybe we ought to teach you some respect. The man still didn't flinch. He simply let his eyes flick toward the biker for a split second, calm and steady, before turning his gaze back to the leader. Respect, the man asked quietly. Funny. I've found that people who demand respect are usually the ones who deserve it the least. The biker lunged as if to grab him, but the leader held up his hand sharply, stopping him mid-motion. Hold it, the leader said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. He turned back to the man, his jaw tightening. You've got a lot of nerve, Wheels. What's your deal, huh? You think you're untouchable because of that chair? The man's expression didn't change. No, he replied evenly. But I think you're making a mistake. The leader laughed again, louder this time, as though trying to convince himself that this was still funny, that this wasn't starting to feel wrong. A mistake? I don't make mistakes. You're sitting in my spot. You had a chance to get up and move, but no, you decided to get mouthy. The man tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. What makes you think I'm the one who needs to move? That smile, that calm, almost mocking smile, did something to the leader. His face darkened. The vein in his temple pulsed as his fists clenched tightly at his sides. His friends shifted behind him, sensing the subtle change in the air. The leader took a step closer, now standing right in front of the table. He loomed over the man like a dark shadow, his face inches away. You've got a death wish, don't you? The cafe fell so silent, you could hear the faint hiss of steam from the espresso machine in the corner. And then, just as smoothly and calmly as ever, the man said, No. I just know how this ends. The leader paused, frowning. What are you talking about? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he straightened in his chair, rolling his shoulders as if loosening up for something. Then he looked up at the leader again, his gaze unwavering. I've seen your type before, the man said quietly. You like to pick on people you think can't fight back. People who look smaller, weaker, people who don't fit your idea of tough. You think that makes you strong, don't you? The leader sneered. I am strong. The man's smile grew, but there was no humor in it. No. You're not. The leader slammed his hand down on the table, the noise like a gunshot in the small cafe. Cups rattled. Someone let out a small gasp. You're really asking for it, pal, the leader growled through gritted teeth. Maybe it's time I shut you up for good. The man's fingers tapped the armrest again, his movements slow, deliberate, completely unafraid. You could try, he said softly. But you won't like what happens next. For the first time, something flickered in the leader's expression: hesitation. Doubt. It was quick, just a split-second crack in his facade, but the man in the wheelchair saw it. You're bluffing, the leader said, but there was no conviction in his words. You think you're some kind of tough guy? The man didn't answer the question. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the window, where the row of motorcycles was lined up like a fleet of shiny trophies. Nice bikes, he said casually. You take care of them. The leader blinked, caught off guard by the shift in conversation. What? Your bikes, the man repeated, nodding toward the window. They look expensive. Custom paint jobs. Shiny chrome. You must be proud of them. The leader narrowed his eyes, suspicious. Yeah. So what? The man shrugged lightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Nothing. Just seems like a lot of work to put into something you might have to leave behind. The leader's face twisted with confusion, then anger. What the hell are you talking about? The man didn't respond. He simply sat there, calm as ever, his fingers still tapping that slow, steady rhythm on the armrest. And then it happened. The cafe door swung open again, this time with the soft ding of the bell above it. The noise was unremarkable quiet, almost pleasant compared to the thundering arrival of the bikers. But when the door opened, the bikers turned instinctively to look. Standing in the doorway was a man in a suit. A sharp, well-fitted suit, with polished shoes and dark sunglasses that matched the biker leaders in style but not in attitude. Behind him, another figure stood broad-shouldered, wearing a black jacket, his face unreadable. The suited man's eyes swept over the cafe, pausing briefly on the bikers before landing on the man in the wheelchair. And then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. The man in the wheelchair returned the nod, just as subtle. The leader frowned. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice sharp. The man in the wheelchair didn't answer. Instead, he smiled. "Like I said," he murmured softly, "you really don't know who you're dealing with." The cafe buzzed with tension so thick it was hard to breathe. The hum of the bikers' mockery echoed off the walls, louder and sharper than before. Boots scraped against the tiled floor as the gang prowled around like circling wolves. Some of the patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, trying not to make eye contact. Others hunched lower, silently begging for the scene to end. But it didn't. The leader of the bikers, a man with a jagged scar down his left cheek and a mean, twisted grin, looked at the man in the wheelchair as if he were a bug to be stepped on. He wasn't used to defiance. Not from someone like this, someone seated, unmoving, and to him, insignificant. "You'll see," the biker mocked, mimicking the man's calm tone with exaggerated sneers. He leaned closer, his face mere inches away. "You've got a big mouth for a guy who can't even stand up." The words hung in the air, cruel and deliberate. His friends laughed on cue, some slapping their knees as though it were the joke of the century. One of them, the lanky one with dirty blonde hair, stepped forward and grabbed the wheelchair's handles again, spinning the man a second time. "Whoops," the lanky biker jeered. "Guess you're going for a little spin." The man gripped the wheels firmly, stopping himself mid-spin with one sharp motion. Slowly, he straightened his posture, his back straight against the chair. His calm demeanor didn't crack. Not once. The cafe owner, a small man with a balding head and a kind face, wrung his hands nervously behind the counter. "Hey," he called, his voice shaking. "That's enough. You're upsetting my customers." The leader turned his head sharply, narrowing his eyes at the owner. "Why don't you mind your own business, old man? I'm having a conversation here." "It's my cafe," the owner replied, though his voice quivered slightly. "You'll leave if you keep this up." One of the bikers took a menacing step toward the counter. "Yeah? Who's gonna make us?" The cafe owner opened his mouth as if to respond but hesitated. His shoulders dropped, his courage evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. The bikers grinned. To them, it was a game: push, intimidate, and watch others fold. It was how they operated. Except one man wasn't folding. "You've made your point," the man in the wheelchair repeated, his voice steady and even. "I suggest you leave now." The leader turned back to him, his grin widening. "Or what?" The man's eyes locked onto the biker's face with the intensity of a hawk watching its prey. He tilted his head just slightly, a faint, knowing smirk flickering at the corner of his lips. "You'll see," he said softly. Across the cafe, at a small table in the far corner, another man watched the scene unfold. He was in his mid-40s, with sharp blue eyes and short dark hair that was graying slightly at the temples. Unlike the rest of the patrons, he wasn't fidgeting nervously or looking away. He wasn't pretending to be busy or minding his own business. Instead, he watched intently. His coffee sat untouched in front of him, growing cold. His hands rested on the table, fingers laced together as he studied the bikers and the man in the wheelchair with quiet focus. Unlike the others in the cafe, this man knew. He knew exactly who the man in the wheelchair was. And he knew what was coming. It wasn't a secret to everyone. The watcher's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. They don't know what they've started, he murmured to himself, too softly for anyone else to hear. The bikers continued their taunts, feeding off each other's energy like fire feeding on oxygen. The lanky biker pulled up a chair and sat down directly in front of the man, leaning back with his arms crossed. "What are you gonna do, huh? Call the cops? Cry for mommy?" The others snickered. One of them, the burly one with a beard and leather gloves, picked up a sugar jar from a nearby table and tossed it into the trash can. The glass shattered, the sound making everyone jump. "Whoops," he said, shrugging. "Slipped." The leader laughed at the chaos. "You know, I'm startin' to think you don't get how this works, Wheels. See, we run this neighborhood. When we say jump, people jump. When we say move, you move. But you," he jabbed a finger toward the man in the wheelchair. "You think you're special or something?" The man raised his eyebrows, unbothered. "Special? No. Just not afraid of you." The leader's grin faltered. "Just slightly." "What'd you say?" "I said I'm not afraid of you," the man repeated, this time louder. The cafe gasped quietly. The bikers froze for a split second, caught off guard by the calm defiance. The leader's grin twisted into a scowl, his patience wearing thin. "You've got some guts, I'll give you that. But you've got no clue who you're messin' with." "And you have no clue who I am," the man replied simply. The room held its breath. The leader scoffed. "Who you are? Yeah, right. What, you think you're some kind of hero? Some kind of tough guy?" The man leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice dropped to a low, quiet tone, a tone that sent chills through the air. "No," he said. "I think you're about to find out." The man in the corner decided it was time to step in, not to stop what was happening, but to push it toward its natural conclusion. He rose from his seat slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor. The bikers didn't notice him at first, too wrapped up in their game. He walked across the room, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically. Finally, the lanky biker noticed and turned to glare at him. "Hey," the lanky one barked. "What do you want?" The man in the corner didn't flinch. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze settling on the leader. "You might want to listen to him," he said calmly, jerking his chin toward the man in the wheelchair. The leader blinked. "Excuse me." The watcher's blue eyes were sharp, his tone firm. "I said you might want to listen to him. You don't know who you're dealing with." The leader barked a laugh. "Not you, too. Who is this guy, huh? Your cousin? Your babysitter?" The watcher didn't answer directly. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, the faintest glimmer of amusement dancing in his eyes. "Have you ever heard of the Paralympics?" he asked suddenly. The question caught the leader off guard. He frowned. "What?" "The Paralympics," the watcher repeated. "You know, the international sporting event for athletes with disabilities." "Yeah, I know what it is," the leader snapped. "What's your point?" The watcher's smile grew just slightly. "You're looking at one of the best athletes they've ever seen. Multiple-time gold medalist. World record holder." The leader blinked. "What are you talking about?" The man in the wheelchair finally spoke up again, his voice steady. "He's telling the truth." The leader turned back to him, his face twisting into a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're lying." The watcher shook his head. "Oh, he's not lying. You might want to reconsider what you're doing here. Because this guy," he pointed toward the man in the wheelchair, "isn't who you think he is." The room fell silent again. This time, the bikers looked less sure of themselves. The cafe patrons whispered quietly, some stealing glances toward the man in the wheelchair with wide, curious eyes. The leader, however, wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. His pride wouldn't let him. Yeah, he scoffed, though his voice sounded weaker now. So what? You think I'm scared of some athlete in a chair? The man in the wheelchair smiled again, calm, cool, and unbothered. You should be, he said softly. The leader's smug grin faltered for a fraction of a second, but he masked it with a snarl. You're full of it, he growled, jabbing a finger toward the watcher. You two planning this together? You think some little story about gold medals is supposed to scare us? The watcher shrugged casually. It's not a story. But hey, keep pushing. You'll see for yourself soon enough. The lanky biker turned to the leader, muttering under his breath, Man, they're just messing with us. Let's show this guy what happens when people talk back. The leader nodded, his scowl deepening. Yeah. Enough talk. The lanky biker grinned, stepping toward the man in the wheelchair with a fake innocence on his face. Look, Wheels, I'll tell ya what. Why don't we give you a head start, huh? We'll let you roll yourself outta here before this gets ugly. The man in the wheelchair stayed perfectly still. He looked at the lanky biker with the kind of calm that unnerved people, not anger, not fear, just pure, unwavering calm. It was like staring at an ocean on a windless day, deep and unmoving. I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly. The lanky biker leaned closer, close enough that his breath hit the man's face. Didn't you hear me? Move. He placed one hand on the wheelchair's armrest, gripping it firmly. That was the final straw. With a sharp, lightning-fast motion, the man in the wheelchair grabbed the biker's wrist and twisted it. Hard. The lanky biker yelped, stumbling backward and clutching his arm. His eyes were wide with shock. What the? The leader's head snapped around, disbelief written all over his face. You good? The lanky biker glared at the man in the wheelchair, his face twisted in pain. He did something. He grabbed me. Don't touch my chair again, the man said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a warning. For the first time, the bikers hesitated. The leader exchanged uncertain glances with his crew, clearly not expecting this kind of pushback. The cafe patrons were frozen, their eyes bouncing between the bikers and the man in the wheelchair. The cafe owner, still behind the counter, muttered under his breath, I told them. I told them. The burly biker with the leather gloves stepped forward next, cracking his knuckles. I don't know what trick you pulled, but you're not gonna try that on me. He towered over the man in the wheelchair, his shadow falling like a heavy blanket. The watcher in the corner shook his head slightly, sighing to himself. Bad move. The burly biker lunged forward, reaching to grab the man's shoulder. But before his hands could make contact, the man in the wheelchair spun his chair slightly, dodging the move with ease. In the same fluid motion, he struck the biker's knee with the heel of his hand, fast and precise. The biker let out a sharp groan and staggered backward, grabbing his leg. AHH. What the? The leader looked stunned now, his confidence unraveling like thread. He pointed accusingly. Who are you? The man straightened again in his chair, his eyes steady. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he asked one of his own. You ever heard of adaptive sports? The bikers exchanged confused glances. The burly one, still limping slightly, muttered, What's that supposed to mean? It means I've spent years training my body to do what yours can't, the man replied. It means you've just picked a fight with someone who doesn't quit. The leader's scowl returned, though this time it was mixed with uncertainty. You think you're tough because you pulled some cheap shots. Cheap shots, the watcher chimed in, shaking his head. He pointed at the burly biker. That guy's twice his size and couldn't land a finger on him. If I were you, I'd stop while you're ahead. The leader rounded on the watcher, his frustration boiling over. You got a lot to say, old man. The watcher smiled faintly. You haven't seen anything yet. Finally, the leader turned back to the man in the wheelchair, his face red with frustration. What is this? Some kinda joke? You just a guy who knows a couple tricks. The man's calm gaze remained steady, as though nothing could rattle him. A couple of tricks, he echoed, almost as if amused. I spent years fighting for every inch of strength in this body. Every move you think is a trick comes from thousands of hours of training, discipline, and failure. His voice held no arrogance, just simple truth. And for the first time, the bikers started to realize that this wasn't an ordinary guy. The lanky one muttered, training for what? The man's lips curled slightly into a small smile. Competition. The kind you wouldn't last 2 minutes in. The leader frowned. What kinda competition? The watcher took a step closer now, addressing the bikers directly. He's a Paralympic athlete, he said, his voice clear and deliberate. You know the guys who train harder than anyone you'll ever meet? Who win gold medals on the world stage while people like you think they're weak? The room went silent. The bikers stared at the man in the wheelchair, disbelief etched on their faces. That's not true, the leader said after a moment, though his voice lacked its earlier bite. He's messing with us. Google it, the watcher said with a shrug. Go ahead. Look him up. I bet you'll find his face plastered all over articles, with medals hanging around his neck. The lanky biker pulled out his phone, fumbling with it as he opened the search bar. His fingers moved quickly, typing something. The leader shot him a glare. What are you doing? Just check in, man, the lanky one muttered. After a few seconds, his face went pale. The phone slipped in his grip slightly as he turned the screen toward the others. There, in full color, was a photo of the man in the wheelchair on a podium, a gold medal hanging around his neck. His arms were raised high in victory, muscles defined, and his smile was the smile of a champion. The caption read, Paralympic Gold Medalist stuns the world with record-breaking victory. The burly biker leaned in, squinting at the phone. No way. The lanky one's voice was hushed. It's him. It's really him. The leader's face darkened as he turned back to the man in the wheelchair. For the first time, he didn't look smug or confident. He looked lost. You're serious, he muttered. You're what? Some kind of athlete. The man nodded slowly. Not just some kind of athlete. I'm one of the best at what I do. You picked the wrong guy today. The cafe was dead silent now. Everyone was watching, the tension stretching so tight it felt like it might snap. The bikers didn't know what to do. Their bravado had been shattered by a reality they hadn't expected, a reality that challenged every assumption they'd made. The leader's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw working as though he were chewing on his pride. He hated losing, and right now, he was losing more than just an argument. You think you're better than us? He asked finally, though his voice was quieter now. The man shook his head. No. But I don't need to prove anything to you. I've already proven it to myself. That answer seemed to hit harder than any punch. The leader looked away, frustration clouding his expression. His friends stood in awkward silence, clearly unsure of what to do next. The watcher broke the stillness. I'd leave if I were you, he said simply. Before you embarrass yourselves any further. The leader shot him a glare, but it lacked venom. He turned back to the man in the wheelchair, staring for a long moment. Finally, he muttered, let's go. The bikers exchanged surprised glances. What? The lanky one asked. I said let's go, the leader barked, his voice sharp. One by one, they shuffled toward the door, their earlier swagger completely gone. The leader paused for a moment, looking back at the man in the wheelchair. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. The man met his gaze with calm confidence. "Yes, it is." The leader said nothing more. He turned and pushed open the door, stepping out onto the street. The rest of the gang followed, their boots heavy against the pavement. Inside the cafe, a quiet murmur rose from the patrons as they began to process what had just happened. The man in the wheelchair sat back slightly, exhaling softly. He glanced toward the watcher and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. The watcher smiled faintly and returned to his seat, finally sipping his now cold coffee. The cafe owner stepped out from behind the counter, looking both amazed and relieved. That was incredible," he said softly. The man in the wheelchair shrugged. "I just don't like bullies." The lead biker's face went pale, his sneer fading into something between confusion and disbelief. He blinked, as though trying to process what he'd just seen. The cafe, once loud with chatter and tension, had gone completely silent. You could hear the hum of the lights above, the distant clatter of traffic outside, but inside, everything felt frozen. The man in the wheelchair sat still now, hands resting firmly on his wheels, his posture steady and strong. There was no anger in his expression, only calm control. He seemed to radiate power without saying a word. What the hell was that?" the burly biker whispered, his voice barely audible. The lanky one, the one who'd been so quick to mock earlier, swallowed hard. He glanced nervously at the leader, unsure what to do next. "Boss, he moved too fast. Did you see that? How'd he even do that?" The leader's eyes darted from the man to his own gang, his confidence unraveling by the second. "It's a trick," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. Just some stupid trick." But the whispers were spreading now. "That's him, isn't it? The Paralympic guy. The one on TV a while back. Gold medals. Broke records or something. I remember. I saw him in the last games. He's a champion." The cafe owner, standing stiffly behind the counter, nodded slowly. "Oh, it's him, all right," he said, his voice cutting through the whispers like a knife. "I knew it the second I saw him." The leader snapped his head toward the owner, frustrated. "You knew?" The cafe owner folded his arms, his confidence returning. "Yeah, I knew. And you should have too. You'd know better than to mess with someone like him if you had any sense." The lead biker's jaw tightened as he turned back to the man in the wheelchair. For the first time, his usual swagger was completely gone. The man simply stared back at him, unwavering. "Who are you?" the leader demanded. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to make the room feel smaller. "I already told you. I'm someone you shouldn't have messed with." Yeah, the leader grumbled. "But what's your deal? Who are you, really?" The watcher from across the room finally stood up. He'd been silent for most of this, but now he took slow steps toward the center of the cafe, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He stopped just short of the bikers and gave them a hard, unimpressed look. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, huh?" the watcher said softly. The lanky biker looked even more nervous. "Man, he's just..." "No," the watcher cut him off. "He's not just anything." The watcher turned toward the man in the wheelchair, his expression softening with respect. "Go on," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Tell them who you are." The man in the wheelchair exhaled slowly, as though he'd been waiting for this moment. He rolled forward slightly, positioning himself so that every single person in the room could see him clearly. "My name," he said evenly, "is Mark Lawson. I'm a 3-time Paralympic gold medalist in wheelchair racing. I've competed against the best athletes in the world, athletes you couldn't even keep up with for 10 seconds. The words hit like a thunderclap. The bikers stared at him, stunned into silence. Gold medalist," the lanky one croaked. Mark nodded once, his eyes still fixed on the lead biker. That's right. Gold medals. World records. Hours upon hours of training that you couldn't begin to understand. And yet, you thought I was helpless. The leader took a step back, as though Mark's words were pushing him away. I didn't know, okay. How were we supposed to know? That's the problem, Mark replied, his voice steady but sharp. You don't bother to look past what you see on the surface. You made your assumptions. You mocked me, touched my chair, disrespected me in ways you probably thought were funny. But you didn't realize who you were dealing with. The lanky biker muttered again, almost to himself. I can't believe this. This guy? The one he trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. The cafe erupted into murmurs again. Patrons whispered to each other, pointing discreetly at Mark, repeating his name. Some even pulled out their phones, searching for him online. Within seconds, a photo of Mark, draped in gold medals and raising his fists in victory, began circulating on screens around the cafe. The burly biker glanced at one of the phones and froze. He's right, he said hoarsely. It's him. Look at this. He showed the phone to the leader, his finger trembling slightly as he tapped the image. The leader didn't look at first, but when he finally did, his face turned red. The photo of Mark on the podium, muscles defined, shoulders squared like a warrior, stared back at him. Mark looked larger than life, powerful and unstoppable. The leader clenched his fists, his pride at war with the reality in front of him. I don't care if you're some athlete, he snapped suddenly, though his voice lacked its usual edge. You still think you're better than us? Mark smiled faintly. It's not about being better. It's about knowing who you are and what you're capable of. I don't need to prove myself to you. The leader opened his mouth to argue, but he had nothing left to say. There was no coming back from this. For the first time since they'd stomped into the cafe, the bikers looked small, out of place, even. They shifted awkwardly, stealing uncertain glances at each other, like schoolboys who'd just been scolded by a teacher. Mark turned his gaze to the lanky biker. I told you earlier not to touch my chair. Do you understand why now? The lanky one nodded quickly, his face pale. Yeah, man. I get it. I'm sorry. The burly biker followed, mumbling, didn't mean no harm. We didn't know. Mark's gaze settled on the leader, the last one standing. The leader tried to hold his ground, but his bravado had vanished. His shoulders sagged, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he muttered, we messed up, all right? We didn't know who you were. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect, Mark said firmly. It's not about my medals or my accomplishments. It's about how you treat people, anyone, no matter what they look like or what you think they can't do. The leader looked away, shame flickering in his eyes. Yeah, he muttered, barely audible. You're right. The cafe owner stepped out from behind the counter, clapping his hands once to break the tension. All right, then, he said, his voice loud and clear. I think you boys have overstayed your welcome. The leader looked back at Mark one last time, then turned sharply toward the door. Let's go, he grumbled to his crew. One by one, the bikers followed him out, their footsteps heavy with embarrassment. The lanky one glanced back at Mark, almost as if he wanted to say something, but he thought better of it and hurried out the door. As the bikers' motorcycles roared to life outside, Mark finally relaxed in his chair. The tension that had gripped the room began to dissolve. The cafe owner let out a breath he'd been holding. Mark, you're something else, he said with a grin. Mark gave a small smile. I just don't like bullies. The patrons began to murmur again, though this time it was different. There was admiration in their voices, respect in their glances. People looked at Mark with awe now, recognizing the strength he carried not just in his body, but in his character. The watcher walked over and patted Mark on the shoulder. "You handled that well." Mark nodded, his expression calm as always. "They'll think twice before judging someone by appearances again." The watcher chuckled. "Let's hope so. You've got a way of leaving an impression, my friend." Mark turned to look out the window. The bikers were riding away now, their noise fading into the distance. He watched them go, then turned back to his coffee, still untouched. "Guess I'll need a refill," he said with a small smile. The cafe erupted in laughter, the tension fully broken. The cafe's atmosphere gradually shifted from tension to something warmer, more relaxed. The silence that had once been filled with nervous energy was now replaced by soft conversation, the clinking of coffee cups, and the hum of quiet discussions. Patrons slowly began to return to their previous activities, though now there was a newfound respect in their eyes. Mark's calm demeanor had made an undeniable impact. No longer the man in the wheelchair they had dismissed, he was now the symbol of strength, discipline, and quiet power. People who had once glanced at him with pity or judgment now looked at him with admiration, as if seeing him for the first time. They'd witnessed his self-control, the way he'd handled the situation without ever losing his cool. It was clear he wasn't just another man in a chair. He was someone who had earned his place through hard work, through challenges, and through victories that most couldn't even imagine. The cafe owner made his way over to Mark's table, holding a fresh cup of coffee. "Here you go," he said, smiling as he set the mug down. "On the house, of course." Mark took the coffee, nodding gratefully. "Thanks. I appreciate it." His voice was steady, calm. It was the same voice that had spoken with such authority just moments before, but now it was softer, almost conversational. The cafe owner pulled up a chair and sat across from him, leaning in slightly. "You know," he said, his eyes twinkling, "I've been in this business a long time. Seen a lot of things. But I've never seen anyone handle a situation quite like that. You've got a way of keeping your cool." Mark chuckled softly, his eyes glancing toward the door where the bikers had just left. "Sometimes you don't have to do much. Just stay calm, stay focused." The owner raised an eyebrow. "Well, you sure showed them. They'll be talking about you for a long time, I bet." Mark shrugged lightly. "Maybe. But it's not about them. It's about the message. Respect people for who they are, not what they look like or what you think you know about them." The cafe owner nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. And maybe you're right. Maybe we all need a little reminder now and then about that." Before Mark could reply, a voice from across the room interrupted. "Hey, Mark." It was the watcher, the man who had stood up earlier and given his silent nod of respect. He was making his way over now, a smile on his face. "I've been meaning to talk to you," he said, pulling up a chair beside Mark. Mark looked at him, his expression unchanged but his eyes warm. "Go ahead," he said, gesturing to the empty seat. The watcher sat down and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "I saw you on TV a while ago," he began. "I didn't recognize you at first, but I remembered your face. You were incredible back then. I mean, truly. I've followed your career. I know what you've done." Mark's eyes flickered slightly, just a hint of surprise, but he kept his composure. "Thanks," he said, nodding. The watcher continued. "You know, most people would have let that whole thing slide. They would have just let the bikers push them around. Maybe they'd have even gotten angry. But you didn't. You didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing you lose your cool. That's real strength, Mark." Mark gave a small, appreciative smile. "I've learned a lot over the years. But the most important lesson? Don't let other people control your reaction. You control that. You decide how to respond. The watcher chuckled softly. That's the kind of wisdom that only comes from experience. And trust me, the way you handled that situation? You gave everyone in here a lesson today. Some of us needed it more than others. The cafe owner, still standing nearby, gave a small laugh. Tell me about it, he muttered, glancing at the now empty table where the bikers had once sat. I think we've all had our share of learning today. Mark's gaze drifted toward the door again, and for a moment, he simply stared out at the street. The sounds of the city outside continued, but inside, it was quiet, almost peaceful. The chaos had passed, leaving only the quiet aftermath. I never set out to teach anyone anything, Mark said softly, almost to himself. But sometimes, it just happens. People need to see things for themselves. They need to realize that it's not the chair that makes me who I am. It's everything else I've done to get here. The watcher nodded, his smile growing wider. That's exactly it. People don't always see the story behind the surface. And sometimes, the ones who are underestimated have the most power. You just showed them that. The cafe owner chimed in again. And the best part is, they'll never forget it. They'll remember you. They'll remember how you handled them. And they'll think twice before ever underestimating someone else again. Mark looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the patrons who had been watching earlier. Some of them were still glancing his way, their expressions filled with new respect. It was clear that, even though they had witnessed something extraordinary, Mark didn't seek the attention or admiration. He was content with the knowledge that he had done the right thing. I don't need anyone's praise, he said quietly. I just need to know I've made a difference, even if it's a small one. The watcher sat back, clearly impressed by Mark's humility. You've made a big difference, he said, his voice firm. In more ways than you know. The moments that followed seemed to stretch, like the calm after a storm. There was no rush to leave. People lingered in their seats, talking softly, sharing stories. The tension had completely evaporated. Mark sipped his coffee, savoring the warmth and comfort of the moment. He had no plans for what came next, he didn't need to. What mattered was that he had faced a challenge, stood his ground, and shown everyone that he was more than just the chair. He was Mark Lawson, a man who had achieved greatness, who had fought for what he deserved, and who would never let anyone tell him what he could or couldn't do. The watcher smiled as he stood to leave. I'm glad I got to see that today. You're an inspiration, Mark. Mark gave him a small nod. Take care of yourself. The cafe owner, wiping down the counter, looked over at him with a grin. So, you gonna stick around and finish your coffee, or are you heading out, too? Mark glanced at his coffee, then at the door. I think I'll stay a while longer. He took another sip, the warmth of the drink filling him with a quiet sense of contentment. The world outside would keep spinning, people would keep rushing around, but for this moment, in this cafe, everything was calm. And that was enough. As the afternoon sun began to lower, casting long shadows on the floor, Mark settled into his chair. The bikers were gone, the noise had faded, and now it was time for the last lesson to be absorbed. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And sometimes, you don't have to show off to prove it. The bikers had never expected this. They had underestimated him in the worst possible way. The chaos they had brought into the cafe, thinking they could bully the man in the wheelchair and get away with it, was now unraveling in front of their eyes. It wasn't just the bikers who had been shocked, it was everyone who had watched. For a moment, the air was thick with disbelief, but soon enough, the quiet started to turn into murmurs. Whispers spread like wildfire through the cafe. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others with newfound respect in their eyes. It was as if the room had collectively woken up to the reality they'd been blind to before. They had seen the man in the wheelchair as weak, as helpless, just another person who didn't matter. But now, they could see him for who he truly was. Someone in the back of the cafe cleared their throat and then slowly, almost nervously, started clapping. The sound echoed in the room, and others followed suit, a soft round of applause slowly building. It wasn't loud, but it was real. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of what had just transpired. The bikers were no longer in control of the situation, and everyone in the room felt it. Mark's eyes flickered briefly toward the bikers as they scrambled to leave. Their confidence, once so brash and bold, had completely evaporated. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced by uncertainty. No one looked back, they simply rushed out the door, their boots clanging loudly on the tiles. As they exited, the doors slammed behind them, and the cafe was left in a quiet hum of conversation. But the man in the wheelchair didn't rush either. He didn't need to. With the calmest of movements, he turned his wheelchair around and wheeled himself back to his table, where he had originally been sitting when everything had started. His posture was composed, steady like a king reclaiming his throne after an unexpected battle. He nodded politely at the stunned crowd as he passed them, acknowledging their respectful silence without needing any words. The man who had been sitting across the cafe, the one who had recognized Mark, stood up slowly from his table. He watched the bikers as they rushed out, a soft smile forming on his face. He clapped his hands slowly, the sound carrying in the stillness. It was a gesture of respect, of admiration, and of understanding. They had no idea, did they? He asked, his voice low but filled with amusement. Mark glanced up at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. People rarely do, he replied, his voice steady, like the calm after the storm. The watcher gave a knowing nod and took a few steps toward Mark's table. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. His eyes were bright, filled with curiosity and respect. "I knew you looked familiar," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I wasn't sure. Now it all makes sense. You're Mark Lawson, aren't you?" Mark gave a brief nod. "That's me." The watcher's eyes widened. "I knew it. You were a Paralympic champion, right? I remember seeing you on TV, winning gold medals. You've done more than most people could ever dream of." Mark's smile remained, but it was a quiet one. "I've had my share of victories," he said. "But that doesn't mean I'm any different from anyone else. I just have a different set of challenges, that's all." The watcher shook his head in awe. "No, you're different. Not just because of the medals or the fame, but because of the way you handled yourself today. You could have easily lost your temper, could have fought back in anger. But you didn't. You showed them who you really are." Mark met his eyes, the truth of the situation settling in his mind. Sometimes, the best way to fight is with patience. People will test you. They'll try to push you, to provoke you. But if you let them control your reactions, they win. The best thing you can do is stay in control, even when they're trying to take that from you. The watcher nodded slowly, taking in Mark's words. That's some powerful wisdom. He sat back in his chair, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. "You know, most people would have been too scared to do what you did. But not you. You handled it with grace, with strength. That's what makes you stand out." Mark gave a small shrug, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't do it for any recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do. People need to understand that it's not about what's on the surface. It's about the character underneath. It's about how we treat others." The cafe owner, who had been standing nearby, overheard the conversation and walked over to join them. "You know," he said with a grin, "I've seen a lot of people come and go in this cafe. But I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that. You've earned everyone's respect here, Mark. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us. Mark nodded in acknowledgement but didn't speak. He wasn't looking for applause or validation. He was simply content that the situation had been resolved peacefully. The bikers had been shown their place, and in the process, Mark had made sure that the message was clear not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. As the minutes passed, the cafe returned to normal. The once tense atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and understanding. People were talking again, but now they weren't just talking about the bikers or the drama that had just unfolded. They were talking about the man in the wheelchair. The man who had been underestimated, who had shown everyone that strength doesn't come from what you see on the outside, but from within. The watcher stood up to leave, pausing before he walked away. "I'm glad I got to see that today," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You're an inspiration, Mark. And I think, today, you reminded a lot of people that there's more to a person than meets the eye." Mark looked up at him, offering a small but genuine smile. "Take care of yourself." The man nodded and walked toward the door, the respect and admiration he had for Mark clear in every step. The cafe owner returned to his work, but his smile lingered as he glanced over at Mark once more. The whole place seemed to have been touched by what had happened, a reminder that even the smallest acts of defiance against injustice can create ripples that change everything. Mark leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. The whole ordeal had taken only minutes, but the effect of it would last far longer. The bikers would no doubt remember this day. And maybe, just maybe, the next time they walked into a cafe or any place underestimating someone because of their appearance, they'd think twice before making the same mistake again. But Mark knew something deeper. It wasn't just about the bikers. It was about everyone. People would remember this moment, and maybe it would change the way they saw others. Maybe it would remind them that a person's worth wasn't determined by the way they looked or the way others judged them. The cafe had become a place of reflection for Mark, but also for everyone who had been there. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt truly seen, not because of his medals, not because of what he had accomplished in the past, but because he had shown people the true meaning of strength, humility, and courage. As the last of the cafe's patrons finished their drinks and filed out, Mark remained seated for a moment longer. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden light through the window. The world outside was moving fast, but in this small cafe, everything had slowed down. Mark had done what he needed to do. And now, he could rest in the knowledge that justice had been served, not with violence or anger, but with calm and dignity. Mark finished his coffee, the warm liquid providing a small comfort after the events of the day. The cafe had returned to its usual rhythm, the sounds of clinking cups and soft chatter filling the air, but the energy had shifted. People spoke a little quieter now, their conversations a little more thoughtful. The cafe, once just a place for casual meetups and afternoon breaks, had become a silent witness to something much more significant. A man in a wheelchair had shown them what strength truly looked like, not in loud, brash actions, but in the quiet, steady power of restraint. Mark wasn't the kind of person to boast or draw attention to himself. He didn't need to. His actions spoke for him, louder than any words could. Someone had kindly brought him a new coffee, and for a moment, he allowed himself to relax. He didn't care much for the praise or attention, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that, for once, people saw him for who he truly was. Not the man in the wheelchair. Not the guy who'd won medals. But the person who, in the face of aggression, had chosen to rise above, to show that strength isn't about who can shout the loudest or who can throw the first punch. Mark finished his coffee, wiped his hands on his jeans, and slowly began to wheel himself toward the door. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light across the street. It felt like the kind of day where anything was possible, a reminder that life can change in an instant. His gold medal legacy trailed behind him, not in the form of medals draped around his neck or trophies stacked on a shelf, but as a quiet strength that followed him wherever he went. He didn't need to wear his past on his sleeve. It lived within him, in the calmness of his demeanor, in the way he carried himself, in the way he handled the world. The world, on the other hand, wasn't always as calm. People often judged based on first impressions, relying on surface-level details to define a person. The bikers, for example, had seen Mark in a wheelchair and immediately assumed he was weak, that he was an easy target for their ridicule and bullying. What they didn't know was that strength wasn't about physicality. It was about what you do when no one is watching. It was about choosing not to react with violence, but with grace and self-control, even when every instinct in your body tells you to do otherwise. Sometimes, the strongest people aren't the ones you see coming. They're not the ones who stand in the spotlight, who wear their victories proudly on their sleeves, or who shout the loudest. The strongest people are often the quiet ones, the ones who stand in the background, waiting for their moment, knowing that when it comes, they will show the world their true power. And sometimes, the greatest victories aren't fought in stadiums. They're fought quietly, in the small, everyday moments, when someone decides to remind the world what they're made of. Mark hadn't fought in the typical sense. He hadn't thrown a punch or shouted insults. He hadn't even raised his voice. He had, instead, fought with dignity, with patience, with restraint. He had fought by showing others that even the quietest among us can make the loudest impact. As Mark wheeled himself down the street, the noise of the city around him seemed distant, as if it was all part of another world. He knew that this wasn't just about what had happened in the cafe, it was about something much bigger. It was about challenging the way people think, about breaking through the stereotypes and assumptions that hold us back from truly seeing each other. It was about understanding that everyone, no matter their appearance or circumstances, has something incredible within them. He passed by people on the street, some too busy to even notice him, others stealing quick glances at the man in the wheelchair. Some people still saw him as just a guy in a chair, someone who couldn't do much. But Mark wasn't bothered by that. He knew the truth of who he was, and no one's judgment could change that. As he rolled through the streets, he thought about the moment in the cafe when the bikers had stepped back, when they had seen him for who he really was. It hadn't been about vengeance or humiliation. It hadn't been about proving them wrong for the sake of ego. It had been about reminding them that everyone, regardless of their situation, had a story, one that was worthy of respect. And sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones shouted from the rooftops. Sometimes, they're the ones told with a quiet strength that demands to be heard, even without saying a word. Never judge a book by its cover, Mark thought to himself, the words echoing in his mind. You might just find yourself in the wrong story. It was a reminder that we all have stories that can't be told at a glance, that can't be defined by the surface. The world too often makes snap judgments based on appearances, dismissing people based on what they think they know. But the truth is, we never truly know someone until we've walked in their shoes, or in Mark's case, until we've seen the world from his perspective. As Mark reached the park where he often went to clear his mind, he paused for a moment, feeling the cool breeze on his face. The sun was low in the sky now, casting long shadows across the grass. It felt peaceful, like the world had settled into a quiet rhythm. The legacy Mark had built, his achievements in sports, his struggles and victories were all part of his journey. But it wasn't the gold medals or the records that defined him. It was the way he chose to live his life, the way he treated others, the way he handled adversity. That was what mattered. That was what left a lasting impact. He took a deep breath and smiled to himself. The world may have underestimated him that day. But he had shown them without raising his voice or causing a scene that sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones fought quietly, with patience, dignity, and strength. And in that moment, Mark knew something important. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to himself that the greatest strength comes from within, and that when the world tries to label you, You can always rise above, just like he had. The day was drawing to a close, and Mark rolled slowly toward the bench where he liked to sit. The world around him was full of noise, chaos, and confusion, but in this small corner of the park, everything felt right. He knew the truth of who he was and no one could take that from him.